Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight, unfortunately, short staff. Fortunately, to my neighborly direction, we have Tom Norman. How you doing, Tom?
Good, Kevin, doing well. Good
So
evening, everyone.
Mala, unfortunately, was not able to make it. Tracy, who I wanted to call out on stream because she just got her MVP. So Tracy is now a Microsoft MVP. I wanted everybody to kind of spam that and keep bothering her about it until she got really annoyed. Uh, but sadly, couldn't make it tonight. So we're probably just gonna keep doing that until she does show up. It'll be a where's Poochie type of thing. So I'm actually very excited that Tracy got MVP status. Uh, my recollection is that she had the second largest number of SQL Saturday appearances over the past 5 or so years. And she's been everywhere on the circuit. She's been doing a lot of volunteer work for the community and absolutely deserves that honor. So, congratulations to Tracy. Hopefully, you'll watch this so that I don't have to say it in person and it can instead be over the uh, impersonal medium of a YouTube video. Well done, Tracy. So, without Tracy tonight, we still have an agenda. Our agenda is pretty simple. Basically, we have some themes that we'll cover in case we need to, but this is a chat driven operation. If you have questions, if you have something you're interested in knowing about, something we might be able to answer or at least make up an answer, drop it in chat. We will definitely try not to look as incompetent as possible, and sometimes we'll succeed. Whether that means incompetence or competence, I actually don't know because the phrasing of that sentence was itself a little weird. Nonetheless, questions in chat, happy to answer them. If you see at the bottom, there's shoptalk@tripass.org. After the stream, between streams, if you have a question, drop us a line. We'll add it to show notes. We'll talk about it and probably sound a little bit less unprepared. Probably still a little unprepared because frankly, it's how I roll. But with that said, in the meantime, Tom, you were looking at Azure Data Studio, the Insider Track Fast Ring Super Secret Squirrel Edition.
Yeah, so today I was reading through Twitter and, just kind of, I glanced through it. I'm not like some of you guys that stay on there and are tweeting all day long and all that kind of stuff. Some of us do have real jobs we have to keep up with and stuff. So just reading through there, and Wolfgang Strasser out of Austria actually put up an article and said that SQL Server Data Tools is now has a preview version in Azure Data Studio. And that really piqued my interest because we are a very heavy user of SQL Server Data Tools, along with, of course, the Azure Data DevOps pipeline and everything. So we deploy through that methodology for our databases. So I was like going, cool, maybe we can get that, and then we would have Macs and everything else that would be able to actually use Database Project. So first of all, if you want to use it, you're going to have to go download or go try it. You're going to have to go download the Insiders edition of Azure Data Studio, and Wolfgang did have a link up there on the article to basically go and download the Insider Edition. And then once you do that, you can go to the extensions within Azure Data Studio, your very last icon on the left side of the page. If you've never worked with or have barely seen Azure Data Studio, and I will admit that I don't get in here that often because it doesn't have a whole lot to offer me yet, but SQL Server Data Tools piqued my interest. So I opened it up and just wanted to do some compares, and I just basically said, okay, let me just open up one of my current projects, one of my current database projects, with the caveat, of course, that I've already got it already all in source control. And, you know, if Azure Data Studio just really messes it up, I can blow it away and then, you know, reclone the project, you know, and start afresh, you know, on my computer. So I opened it up, and one of the very first things, of course, in Azure Data Studio, it said it wanted to do is, I need to go do some modifications to your database project. And I'm going, okay. And it says, but it won't mess up anything. Your you know, Visual Studio will still work the same. I'm going, okay.
Famous last
So
words.
famous last words. So I said, go ahead and do it. Do whatever you're going to do. And then once it did it, I opened up and just was poking around basically to see, okay, what have they got done? What's missing that we use and stuff like that? And a couple of things right off the top of the head that I did not see is, it looks like any script that if you use SQL Server data tools at all, you know that you can turn around and write scripts and say, don't put them in the build, but you can still get them checked into source control that you're using them, etc. Well, two of those scripts that are that way is basically your post-deployment script and your pre-deployment script. And if you've used SQL Server data tools at all, you know that that's a couple scripts that you use quite frequently, or can use quite frequently depending upon what you're doing. So it looks like none of your scripts that are in a non-build mode are there. And you know, you open it up and it just didn't even pull them in, didn't even pull them into the SQL project. So, which makes sense because you're building, you're deploying something, and these scripts really aren't building. You may deploy them through a post-deployment script or a pre-deployment script, but you're missing those items. So those are not there quite yet. The other thing that I noticed right off the top of my head is basically, at least in our SQL data projects, SQL Server Data Tool projects, we actually, I like to be consistent even down to the developer level, and to say basically that the database is possibly in, for example, full recovery mode. Not that I would do that on a developer, but there are other settings like transparent data encryption on, trustworthy on. If you do that, not saying I do, full text search, whatever else you might have turned on, those are not there. You can't, it doesn't look like you can set any of those settings. Now it still has database references though. So it looks like you can pull in multiple projects. I tried, I've just been playing with this probably about 30 or 40 minutes. I tried to pull in another project beside it, and yeah, it won't even let me open up a second database project in Azure Data Studio side by side, which of course in Visual Studio, you have a solution and you have multiple database projects there that you can work with. So those are some of the things I saw. The other thing I didn't see is basically a published profile. A published profile, an example of that is like in the development area, by default, turned on in a publish of a database is don't allow data loss. Well, if you're in a QA or dev environment, you're like going, okay, if they mess up their machine, you know, I'm gonna let them do that. I'm gonna turn that off so that it will publish the database. But there's other things where you can exclude things like, for example, encryption information or data classification information. But there's a ton of stuff that you can really customize a publish of a database to of how you want it to deploy as the DBA or as the DevOps person. And none of that's there yet. So it's still coming, still looks good. You can add files, but I will say when you right click to add a file, you're very limited in that you can only add right now a table, a stored procedure, a script, or a view. And if you go add file within Visual Studio, as you're well aware, there is tons and tons and tons of templates, um, from security to stored procedures to functions to you name it. But hey, maybe they're finally telling us to stay away from functions because they didn't give us a template for it yet, you know. So
Yet.
those are some of the things I've seen as a first take on it. Looks like you can publish it. Yeah, but like I said, it's very, very limited on its capabilities. And if you're doing post and pre-deployment scripts, you're kind of out of luck right at this moment.
Makes sense. And to note, this is early preview. I believe this is the first public preview of that particular tool.
And that's correct, Kevin. It's the first time I've seen it, and I've been looking for it for a couple of years because, I would, I would love to move over to Azure Data Studio, but until this is complete, I can't move there yet.
Makes sense. So a couple of comments in chat. The Duke mentions that the versioning capability is definitely a good selling point for this. Also, it supports cross-platform SQL profiling.
Yeah, it's definitely got a lot of capabilities. The abilities of Azure Data Studio, period, of the different things you can add in. There's so many different extensions you can add into it. Central Management Server, you've got some Redgate tools, some Idera stuff, you've got Ozar stuff. There's so much you can add into it. I think SP2's in there. So it's really, really good that they've done this. So looks like I just hit SP and they've got a Spanish language pack. So I wonder if you can, everything will go in Spanish for you instead of English.
Maybe. Lots of other database support was in preview. Don't know if many still are. Remember Postgres being in preview. So Postgres moved out of preview. It is an extension that you can install. There's a little bit of weirdness with Postgres, specifically around how if you lose a connection, then the instance of Azure Data Studio can get caught in a weird state where it thinks that your connection is dead, even though you've reconnected, and it'll just keep throwing the same error message until you open up a new query window and connect again. But aside from that, it worked pretty well for the little bit, very little bit that I was doing around Postgres. Works with, I'll call it regular Postgres, but also with Citus or Hyperscale. And connectivity there was just the same. It wasn't any different as far as I was aware or concerned. So it's still pretty beta. I think it's in non-beta status. It is technically still a v0 release and technically still a public preview. So I guess, yeah, kind of beta. But it felt reasonably complete. There were a couple of issues that I saw other people had, specifically the issue I ran into. So I know that there's stuff that they have to work on, but it's not like the thing was falling apart constantly and just wouldn't connect. The really early days of SQL Operations Studio and the pretty early days of Azure Data Studio, there'd be problems where the answer was essentially, just reinstall the product and maybe that'll fix it. So way better than that. That doesn't sound great when I say it, but
yeah, Azure Data Studio definitely is coming along. I'm actually going to use it in my class, hands-on lab I'm teaching next month, but it still has work. So
absolutely. And it's
maybe by the time I retire, it'd be a Class A product.
Could be. You still have people complaining that Enterprise Manager was replaced with Management Studio, so there's going to be some friction. And right now, that friction is pretty well deserved because it feels like it's like 40% complete for developers, maybe 50% complete, and about 20% complete for DBAs. To where you can, as a database developer, I can work in Azure Data Studio for a while, and I will eventually hit something that just drives me back to Management Studio to do that thing. And it's difficult to just stay in Azure Data Studio. There are some niceties that make life pretty good over there. I mean, notebook support is really nice. I do appreciate that. The extensions, it is a lot easier to build an extension because this is all VS Code based, and extensions are relatively simple, especially compared to the old GDI implementations. Like the stuff you had to do to extend Visual Studio was still easier than trying to extend Management Studio. There are fun horror stories from people who had to do it for a living, and it was just kind of a train wreck. So in that regard, the extensibility is nice, and I think long run that will give enough for it to be a viable day-to-day product for the bigger majority of data platform professionals someday.
I'm looking here at one of the extensions, SQL Server Profiler for Azure Data Studio. Have you used that yet, Kevin, by chance?
No, I have not, but that's the one that the Duke was mentioning, that there's cross-database profiling. So checking this out,
It looks like even though it says it's SQL Server Profiler, it looks like it's a lightweight extended event-based profiler. So
yeah.
it's not quite like the profiler that we have in SSMS. It looks like it's more driven X event wise, which, you know, we'll see how much longer profiler is going to stay around. I think I got another 10 years till I retire at least.
I wasn't gonna rant on this, but then you brought it up. Now I'm gonna rant on this. The name, what do they call it? The SQL Server Management Studio Events Profiler, or whatever they call it. This is the new profiler. They should never have called it profiler, because that completely harms the notion of understanding that profiler, as in the thing that was a really heavyweight graphical interface over server-side tracing, can knock over servers because it is a very heavyweight operation. It has a significant observer effect, where the new profiler, by using extended events, has a much lower observer impact. There's still some, but it's significantly lower than the old profiler. But it is so difficult to tell people, don't use profiler, use profiler.
Yeah, it's I'm sitting here looking at the name X event profiler versus SQL profiler. So yeah,
Right, and given that, if you understand extended events, okay, X event profiler makes sense. But if you're trying to introduce a newer database administrator or a developer who just wants to figure out why this query is not working right, they don't know what an X event is. So naming it that isn't helpful. Naming both of these things profiler, completely unnecessary. And considering that everybody calls it profiler, nobody calls it SQL profiler. Because why do you have the extra word? It's one word, profiler, fairly easy off the tongue, hard for me to mess up, and considering how frequently I mess up words, that's saying something.
Well, it's interesting that as you say that, I know that I saw an article, there's this war going on per se, people going, use X events, use the SQL profiler, use X events, use the SQL profiler. And I know that there is additional functionality in X events,
Mm-hmm.
X events, but you know what? I can still spin up profiler 10 times faster, I believe, than I can X events. And as soon as they fix that issue, then I'll probably go to X events.
Well, I think that's no longer really true. Um, Part of it, so big part
Sell
of it.
me.
I'll
Sell
try
me
to sell
now.
you on this. I will try to sell you on this. A big part of why you think that Profiler is faster is that you have so much muscle memory dedicated. So when you open up Profiler, do you ever go to include any extra columns or any extra events?
Yes, I do.
All right. So the process of adding, say, like database name, or if you want to filter down to errors, it is several clicks of the mouse. It's the same number of clicks of the mouse to set up an extended event that does the same stuff. It's just that you don't have that muscle memory of having done it hundreds of times over the years. So it feels slower because there's the mental overhead of I have to read the screen, I have to understand what this is. Also, there was no UI in 2008. The UI in 2012 was garbage. In 2014 it was slightly better garbage. In 2016 it was okay. And it's slowly gotten better. The X event profiler, as much as I hate the name, does a pretty decent job of building up something that is close to what SQL Profiler gives you in terms of the events that it delivers are similar to what the default SQL Profiler trace gives you, except without being a huge burden on your system. So Mike mentions it's why we sit in the same chair in a room consistently. It's efficient. Yes, there's benefit in habit, but this habit comes at a cost. I mean, this is Profiler is one of the biggest weights that you can put on a SQL Server instance as a database administrator. And there have been plenty of cases where people have knocked over busy servers trying to figure out what's going on with Profiler. Like, oh, this server is busy, CPU's at 100%. Well, let's turn on Profiler and see what's causing this. And then the
Yeah,
server becomes
yeah,
unresponsive.
right.
Because there's even worse is I'm going to remote into the machine and then run Profiler on the machine locally.
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
They named it that way so consultants can be paid money to have to explain it. I wish it were that simple. The grand conspiracy theory at least has a nice bit of closure. More likely, it was some marketing person who said, I don't know. The name Profiler, you already have a profiler, so name it Profiler. That way people already know it's Profiler.
Yeah, they're trying to convince you that, basically that they they are one and the same, they're trying to get that crowd that basically is over there in the SQL profiler to move to the X event profiler and say it's the same thing. Just come on over.
Yeah, I guess
Try it. You'll like it.
I guess I can see that, but I still just despise the fact that it's named the same.
I'm
It
with
becomes confusing for people who don't understand the difference.
I'm with Denny Cherry in the fact that a couple of years ago I saw an article from him that basically said, I'm gonna stay in the profiler till I'm dead and gone, till they actually rip it out of my hands.
Yeah, and all right, I mean, I'm not gonna go take Profiler away from Denny. Just like if
We know we
Anders
know
were in
we at
chat,
least we know we at least have 10 years because they keep putting it in the new SSMS versions. They
oh
keep Yeah, if they keep leaving it in there and keep deploying it to the machine every time they give us a brand new version of SSMS, who's going to leave?
So, all right, considering the uproar that happened when they took out debugger and database diagrams, two
Right.
things that really just didn't work.
I'd
There
agree
was
with the
an
debugger. Yeah.
uproar. You take out Profiler, and there will be DBAs with pitchforks and torches ready to burn down Building 94. Um,
I agree
there's
with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
so yeah, it's I don't see that going away any decades soon, and you, I understand. I understand that feeling of I know this tool well and just want to go with this tool. That's fair. If I'm sure that if Anders were in chat tonight, he'd be extolling the virtues of Enterprise Manager and how it's all been downhill since SQL Server 2000. To make Alan Hurt happy, they could call the new profiler Profiler with the 2 words and a space. I like it. TG, you're sold. You're new marketing person. Also points out that Profiler does not work when you have more than 64 cores. I did not know that.
I didn't know that either. Of course,
I
I've never had a machine that big, so and I don't think I'll ever have one that big.
at this point probably not.
No. I'm in my retirement job. I got one production server. That's all I want.
Solomon says, and query analyzer plus ISQL. Yeah, see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm sure that there is somebody out there who says, look, this whole user interface thing was a mistake. SQL command.exe is good enough for anybody. And if you don't think so, then you're just not a real developer.
I wonder how long it will take them to get Azure Data Studio up to par with SQL Server Management Studio so people will switch over.
All right, that's a good question. Point of comparison, Visual Studio Code is, at least from what I'm seeing, it's getting to the point where for uh, the less stodgy folks, you're seeing that as a perfectly viable alternative to using full-on Visual Studio in most cases. There are specific cases where VS Code just will not work for the job. You need what's in Visual Studio. But for average developer, especially working on hobby projects, I think they've hit that point. And Azure Data Studio is a couple years newer, not the same number of developers, not the same level of focus. So it'll probably take a while. TG mentions legally you can't use it if you are an enterprise of a certain size. Yeah, I'm not. That's a fair point about licensing that I will readily admit I don't know much about. And
Is he
that
saying you
may,
can't use Azure Data Studio?
um, or VS Code in general. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, VS Code, because there are it's a good
Some licensing
question.
things.
I'm guessing it's because the licensing itself is MIT, and that may be there may be something around enterprise that there's no enterprise licensing option for it. Um,
Interesting.
there is a product license detail here, and I'd have to read it, and then I'd have to understand it, and that's 2 problems I have with licensing. But I'll drop a link in chat for anybody who's interested in Visual Studio Code licensing. Is
So
MI
yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see for sure because there's I like the avenue that Azure Data Studio basically allows you to the notebook part is really nice if you've got some troubleshooting that you need to hand off to someone else and you can document, what you need to do to fix this particular issue. And as I am staring retirement down the throat, it's basically as I start working, I have not switched over to Azure Data Studio, but that would be a very handy way for me to document to my my other guy that helps me, plus whoever follows me, basically to turn around and document things for them in Azure Data Studio.
Yeah,
So
that's
that'd be,
a good use of it. So Mike asks, is MIT a reciprocal license because industry stays away from those open source projects that require give back? Short answer is no. MIT is a permissive license, so you can use it commercially. They could sell the data commercially, or excuse me, sell the product commercially. You can extend Visual Studio Code, modify, and sell commercially. So you could have a commercial extension, for example, on Visual Studio Code. You can modify it for private use. So you could take the code for VS Code, bring it into your company, make modifications, and use it internally. Does not come with liability or warranty, but essentially it is available, but does not require give back like AGPL or GPL3. MIT tends to be one of those licenses that larger organizations are okay with. It's usually one of the good examples of the ones that they are good with. BSD is also another license that usually you can get away with. But once you start talking GPL, then lawyers get antsy. But again, remember, I don't know squat about licensing. Just leave that as forefront of everything. My knowledge of licensing is very limited, and I am sure that I get some of the nuances of it wrong. Though experience of mine has been that companies are usually good with MIT. So while we were talking about Azure Data Studio, Viable Clan member asks, I'm looking at upgrading my MySQL to Postgres. Is SQL Server still really expensive and per CPU license? Okay, the short answer, and this was specifically for business use, 24 CPUs, not really getting too high of CPU utilization. Probably could be a bit lower than 20%, or excuse me, a bit fewer than 24 cores and still be okay. That's guessing on my part, but we'll talk about that. A couple more things. Solomon says Apache 2.0 should also be good. Yeah, Apache licenses generally pass even the strictest corporate legal beagles without too much pain. Have I been through the corporate licensing ringer? Yes, I have. And mostly it's been around importing open source projects to use because, my team's predictive analytics team, a lot of the stuff we want to bring in, third-party licensing galore, and we have to make sure that we don't bring in anything that would necessitate, for example, that we have to release all of our code. So legal takes a pretty solid look at these things, but they do have general guidelines of if it's under one of these licenses, you don't really have to ask. If it's under one of these, you don't have to ask because we're going to say no. And if it's not, then you have to ask, and we'll have to decide whether it's worth the company bringing in or not. Okay, so SQL Server, licensing, and cost. Fortunately, he's actually in chat as well. Thomas Grosser gave us an entire talk on licensing in SQL Server, and I am not even going to try to recapitulate it. What I will do is drop a link in chat so that Viable Clan member, you can check out that video. The short answer is that licensing is actually it's more expensive than it was in 2010. But I want to make sure that I don't give you the time. I don't want you coming in at like 20 minutes in. There you go. So SQL Server changed to a core-based model in 2012, and that's where CPU cores, number of CPU cores really matters. It is going to be more expensive than Postgres, just because at the end of the day, you could install Postgres and just run with it. There are options that will help you out in making that licensing a bit less expensive. So check out that video if you are interested, and it'll tell you a bit more about the licensing options. But if you're talking for organizational use, yes, it will have to be licensed, it will cost, and trying to find ways to minimize the number of cores above a certain threshold. Like 1 core doesn't make sense because you have to buy packs, of course. So there's a minimum price you're going to pay, and the idea is to get that many cores, not have to pay for more, not have to pay for things that you're not going to use, and there are arts to licensing that other people are good at. So Anupama asks, can licenses be shared among ports? I'm not sure what you mean by that question. Unless you're asking, if you're asking about named instances, like on the same SQL server, on the same server, let's talk real simple physical hardware, same server, 3 instances of SQL Server installed, you license the server. So you can have as many instances of SQL Server installed on that machine. They're all licensed because you're licensing the entire server.
Remember though, when you do that, that you're going to up your CPU count to be able to process that SQL Server, those 3 instances. So the more instances you have, probably the more cost you're going to have. So, one way or the other.
Yeah, or another way to phrase that is there's overhead to named instances. It's not a free lunch. And there's a little bit more difficulty in effective resource management if they are used in different ways at different times. The practice of optimizing can get a little tricky. But as far as licensing goes, yeah, license the whole server. It gets a little bit different with virtualization. And that's where I would say, check out the YouTube link. Go watch Thomas's talk. He did an outstanding job of explaining all of the gory details around this. So absolutely worth your time there. And if you are looking at a company where that cost is significant, then yeah, Postgres is absolutely a viable option. My preference in that space is Postgres over MySQL. Number one, I hate Oracle. And I admit that it is good to hate Oracle. It's also maybe not the reason that a lot of people want to hear when they're listening for like logical reasons, but it is forefront in my mind. Postgres has always felt like a more complete database platform. MySQL, I go back to the olden days. And mind you, this has not been true for a long time, but up to version like 3.3, there were no foreign key constraints. So many of these things just weren't there, and the early attitude was essentially, why would you need those? And like I said, it has changed. MySQL has absolutely grown quite a bit since those 3.3 days. But it does feel like Postgres tends to have a more complete picture of, say, the ANSI standard. They tend to have more thorough implementations. They tend to be a bit more production oriented. And I'm praising all of this knowing and kind of laughing in my mind a little bit that Postgres was a spinoff from the Oracle folks who wanted Oracle to move faster. So why the hate? Uh, I mean, mostly it's just visceral. I mean, I don't I don't really hate Oracle. It's like competing ball clubs where you've got the enemy that stayed up north, or uh, everybody's most hated baseball team, the Yankees. Unless you are a Yankees fan, in which case everybody else hates the Yankees. So it's sort of like that in my mind. It's not so much, yeah, okay. There are reasons I don't like Oracle. I don't like the licensing practices, which are essentially to have large goons pick you up, shake you, get all the money out of your pockets. The licensing agreement for Oracle is essentially how much money do you have. Show us the details of your bank accounts, and we'll tell you how much you have to pay. I'm being hyperbolic, but it's what it feels like.
I know that Oracle, if I remember right, you have to buy like every little nook and cranny and piece that you're going to work with. And I kind of like that we have SQL Server, you buy it and you've got a plethora of stuff that you can choose to use. So I really like that.
Yeah, that was definitely a marketing difference between the two platforms. Where with Oracle, it was essentially you'll get these things built in, and oh, you want full text search? All right, well you can pay extra for that module. Oh, you want partitioning? Okay, well you can pay extra for that. Oh, you want compression? All right, well you can pay extra for that. Oh, you want a client tool that doesn't suck? You can pay extra for that. That's the licensing that I'm talking about, where it feels like it's it's sort of like games with microtransactions, except that those games usually are cheap to get into. They're expensive to get into, and then they hit you with the microtransactions. Oracle also owns VirtualBox, and I do like that, says Solomon. Yeah, and again, 70% of this is just rah rah, boo these people. 30% of it is business practices and licensing arrangements.
Are we really going to use VirtualBox anymore, or because now we've got WSL 2.0 in our Windows, we can do containers?
Tom's got a point here. Got a point. So yeah, that's as far as the product itself goes. I've got some problems with peripheral things around Oracle, like OBIEE. Did not like that. Didn't like OBIEE at all. But the box product, the Oracle box product, that server is really good. There's a reason they have been at that top of the relational database world. I'll say top 2 slots. That way there's no disagreement here, because no one's going to say DB2 is better than SQL or Oracle. And if you do, I disagree with you. But we can argue about which one's number 1 and which one's number 2. Their product is really good. It is an excellent database platform. It has been for several decades.
Decades.
Yeah, I think the Oracle mythos is a little overdrawn, and part of it was so that Oracle DBAs got paid more, but they do a good job. Containers and VMs are different. Yes, they are different. There are cases where virtual machines will be important, and you can't use containers to do the same job. That's fair. For a lot of things that we use VMs for, especially I think in Tom and my experience, where a lot of it is presenting, a lot of it is trying to recreate a reproducible environment. Containers do a good job there. Aren't Oracle DBAs kind of snobbish or condescending to other database platform folks, or is that not so much the case now? I kind of hit that on the tangent. I'd say a lot less so today. A lot less so today. I don't think they're snobbish or condescending any longer. If you go back 15, 20 years, yes, absolutely, because SQL Server people were, I'm gonna say like Stanley Kubrick 2001, um, grabbing bones and throwing bones at the monolith. That was how your Oracle person interpreted a SQL Server person, and then they would look down on DB2 people as much as I just did. So again, I'm still mostly just making fun of DB2. There's really not that much wrong with DB2 either, except for the whole why do you only have 8 characters to give for a column name?
I know
Yes,
that
I know that
at our
changed.
work this week, we've brought on a bunch of contractors, and we're actually now using a version of containers to basically deliver Windows and all the databases to them, where before, if I even put them in a Dropbox for them to pick up and put on their local server and to turn around and restore them and all, they would be doing it for 4 to 5 to 6 hours trying to get their database up. And the container system we're now using, it's 45 seconds per machine to bring it up. So you want a database SQL Server? Here, give me a minute. I'll be right back to you. Here's your connection string. So it's beautiful,
Yeah,
beautiful.
there are good setups for it. I mean, there are other cases. I do agree with Mike. There are cases where virtual machines can solve a job that containers cannot solve, and that's before we even get into the craziness around container security or relative lack thereof. But as a general principle, for a lot of things that we use VMs for, um, we can use containers, even if that is not 100%. Even if it's
Especially for our presenting and stuff like that. There's a
oh
lot
yeah,
of times we can use containers, and you can spin them up and down and all that kind of stuff. So really quickly.
right. And I'm not even considering that. Oh well, and you can't do certain SQL Server functionality because it's SQL Server on Linux, or there's certain functionality that will work on Linux but won't work on containers. I'm not considering that. Just even if you pretend that same developer space, same administrative space, same everything. Uh, there are cases where yes, you cannot solve a job with containers. I'd say probably about I don't know 50 to 60% of the cases where we'll spin up a VM to do something, you could solve it with a container with roughly the same level of ease, as long as you understand both sets of technologies.
Right. They have their places. They have their, for what you're going to use where. So I just like not having to spin up a VM anymore. I'm like going, I don't want to do a VM, especially when I'm speaking and stuff like that. So I've actually got around my speaking, Kevin, by, um, you know, especially when I'm talking about encryption and stuff like that, I've been able to get around it by using database project, and basically I destroy the database and just go rebuild the database, and it's back in its original pre-presentation mode with everything set and ready for me to do the demos, which is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the things that you learn when presenting is the beauty of idempotence. The beauty of I have performed an action, and the process of performing the action means that if I perform the action again, I will be in exactly the same place as I was. So I have deployed a database, and if I deploy the database again, I will have it exactly like the first time I deployed it. So I can make whatever changes I want, do whatever demonstrations, destructive demonstrations or destructive testing, and then do some action and get back to that state that I wanted to be at. And it took me a while to really understand the benefits of it, it took about 3 presentations where none of the demos worked because I didn't reset the environment right before I started
Right.
adding environment reset scripts at the end of my presentation that I could just run. And for some of these talks now, if I can, deploy containers, because now I don't even have to have reset scripts. It's just destroy and recreate the container. So that does make life easier.
Yeah, that's probably the hardest thing to do as far as when you're speaking is how to get your environment back to square one where you can basically do it again and not have demo issues because you forgot something.
Yep. Especially with the dual stresses of, okay, I just got finished speaking, so I've hit that low, and there are people asking me some questions, and I've got to pack up because the next person's coming in, so I may not run that script right afterwards. And the right before, where, okay, I'm gonna make sure, let me run through all of my demos before the talk. All right, awesome, they all work, and then I forget to run the cleanup script to bring it all back, or I forget the process to bring it all back. And that's where having those scripts helps. It's where having containers really helps. Virtual machines, if you use something that gives you VM snapshots, then you could do that. You could roll back to the snapshot and keep going forward. It is a little clunkier, and the free VMware, so VMware Player, the free edition, doesn't let you really do that. I don't know about VirtualBox, and Hyper-V, I don't like their snapshotting very much. So it's where, yeah, I don't think there's a great reversion mechanism, especially if your reversion mechanism also reverts the operating system. So you're constantly in a state of, let's install new patches and reboot in the middle of your talk. Not necessarily the best place you want to be either. Let's talk about Mala's book corner. Mala actually is in chat. I saw her typing a little bit. Ooh, does Hyper-V still collide with all other VMs? Yes, it does. So you cannot have Hyper-V and VMware Player running at the same time. With VirtualBox, I think I remembered seeing VirtualBox and Hyper-V. I think I got them both running on the same machine at the same time, but I don't remember. I know that it does collide with VMware, and I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that both of them want to control networking on the host computer, so they just do not get along. And if you have one, you can't have the other. Mala is here in chat. So Mala had her book corner, which we're going to get to next week, or next time Mala's able to make it in person. So instead, I'm going to do Kevin's book corner, which is the knockoff edition of Mala's book corner. You can tell it's a knockoff because I only have one book. So tonight's book, Spark in Action, by Jean-Georges Perrin. So Jean-Georges is another person in the Research Triangle area. He is a longtime IBM person, runs the Apache Spark user group down here, and is the author of Spark in Action, which is a hefty 500 some pages dealing with Apache Spark and going up to Spark 3, which just recently got released. So if you are interested in Apache Spark, I would say that there aren't that many great books on the topic. And I would recommend this book. A lot of the earlier books tended to suffer from the problem that the authors typically strayed on one side or the other of demos. It was either all of the demos are incredibly simplistic and don't really explain much, or all of the demos are like 3-line snippets of code with no context, and even the GitHub repos would be about 30% complete, with the expectation that, oh, well, you should know that you have to create all of these things around it in order to get those 3 lines to work. And this book does a pretty good job of bridging that gap between simplistic demos that don't really help you understand and demos that don't help you understand because they're missing data or they're missing a lot of information. Now, he does like to use Java a lot. I won't hold that against him. There are examples in all 3 languages that Spark uses, Java, Scala, and Python. The book is mostly about Java, though. But, honestly, the interfaces, the APIs are so similar between the 3 that there's very little you look at and say, oh, I don't understand this because I only know Scala. You'll look at that and say, okay, well, it's easy. It's pretty easy to follow. Or I only know Python. Yes, there are classes that you're not going to know about, and because this is Java, the demos are probably about 2 times as long as they need to be. If they were written in Scala, they'd be that much shorter. Nonetheless, pick up a copy of that book, maybe like 6 copies of it, and go check it out, especially if you are interested in Spark as a platform. I suppose even if you're not interested in Spark as a platform, because it's a hefty tome, it can definitely hold up a monitor pretty well. So that was my book corner, which, you figure Mala's book corner is like the Powell's or the Book Loft of book corners, where all the books are fancy, everything's nice, it's got that independent feel. And then mine is the newspaper stand where I've got chiclets and old copies of newspapers. So that's the visual representation I want to give of Kevin's book corner versus Mala's book corner. So with that, I think we are getting close to the end. Looks like I have filibustered chat effectively, so I win this round. Tom, anything interesting going on your end other than the Azure Data Studio experience?
No, not really. Besides just using the containers and getting that environment sped up pretty quickly. I will say it was Windows containers and not Linux SQL. So, but you have to use a third-party product to do that. You can't do it naturally to date. So,
I gave my Linux containers scowl of disapproval. Or excuse me, my Windows container scowl of disapproval.
I love my Windows containers. We're not, until they get closer. I do encryption and stuff. We don't use I. The one thing we have not done yet, and which we need to do, and of course it's trying to get it scheduled, is we want to move away from Windows local machine certificates for things into Azure Key Vault. And at some point when we get that done, we'll bring that up. We'll talk about exactly what happened, and I do have scripts that know how to do it and stuff. It's just a matter of getting them to change the application of where they're looking for that particular certificate and stuff. So
okay, so I will try to bother Tom about that every week until he breaks down and just shares it with us.
I'm just waiting for my developers, man. I'm going, come on, I'm ready. So yep, and the only other thing we're doing, is basically we've got all our developments on development now in 2019, if you haven't gotten there, and then we are pushing forward getting our QA environment. And probably one last thing, Kevin, we should always mention is Past Summit 2020